So in this video, I want to walk through getting set up with instaSeq, just to walk through some of the options that are going on in here and help sort of explain some of the details of what's happening. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that my MIDI controller is sending data into Max. Now, something that happens if you're using Loop MIDI or if you're using like an external program to send MIDI to Ableton, you can create feedback loops, in which case Max is sending MIDI to Loop MIDI, and then Max is receiving that MIDI back from Loop MIDI and creating this loop. And when that happens, your Loop MIDI port might get muted. So if it turns red in Loop MIDI, then you need to hit the little circle on the bottom left of the Loop MIDI window to clean it. So the best thing to do to avoid that is to go in here and explicitly specify your MIDI controller as the input device. So Max is only receiving MIDI input from your MIDI controller and not from Loop MIDI, which is part of the problem. Make sure you're sending to the correct output port right there, so you can send MIDI to Ableton. And I've got my sequencer lined up. Now, if I play some notes on my keyboard, right, you'll notice that I can see which MIDI notes I'm playing right here, but nothing's happening over here. And the reason why is I need to tell instaSeq what MIDI note should play the Z key, and that's what these are for. And for the most part, you can probably just use these presets, which will sort of configure it for keyboard layouts or for layouts where you just have like 8 pads in a row. These should be good starting points for either. If for some reason you want to use a different octave in your keyboard, you can use octave 60 for Z and 72 for A, or whatever you want to do. Similarly, if your pad instrument starts on 0, for example, then you might need to do something like this to make it work. And you can see which MIDI note your controller is sending out right here, or in the MIDI monitor as well, of course. So I'm going to select this from my keyboard, and now I'm going to see the instantly respond to my MIDI keyboard sending notes. I made a little diagram here to explain how the MIDI keyboard is mapped to this 8-beat grid. And basically it starts on C, C sharp, D, D sharp for the first 4, and then F, F sharp, G, G sharp for the second 4. What this means is that C, D, F, G gives you a nice sort of evenly spaced set of rhythms, and then the sharp notes sort of fill in the gaps, right? So I thought that would be easy, and then exactly the same thing for the octave above. Now something else that we have is we have ratcheting on A and A sharp, and a transpose on A and A sharp, the octave below that. Right, so transpose is here 1 and 2, ratchet is here 1 and 2. And then B, the MIDI note B, is freezing. So 47 is sort of programmed in. If I hit B and let go of my keyboard, it plays those notes forever. And hit B again to clear it. You can set which MIDI note you want to use for freeze. If you wanted to use E, for example, which is a note that we're not using, that would also be a good option for freeze. So that's up to you. Notice that we have the MIDI note outputs. I'm playing a pitched instrument right now, right? So maybe I want to make it play an octave. So this is playing an octave higher than this. All right, that makes sense. And say I want my transposes to also be like a 3rd and a 5th. Actually, probably a 2nd and a 5th would actually maybe stay in key a little bit more. So you can change what transpose you're using right there. I'm going to mirror CC to Ableton. Again, I'm going to make sure that I'm selecting my MIDI keyboard here. And now I can also use Ableton's MIDI map to map my CC controls to anything I want to control over here. One thing that might be particularly useful, mapping the sends, A is reverb, B is delay, is always very useful. And also mapping your track volume might be really useful. So right now I have my track volume mapped to CC24. You can see right here it says CC24 is controlling my track volume. And I can decide, for example, that I want to have a limit to that. So I can change the range of my mapping by manually changing the minimum and maximum. You can also right-click and invert the range if you want to. That can be helpful. And then other controls, just any of these controls you want to control. And then you can change the range of them however you want to. So another good thing to keep in mind is that if you do put down a sequence, and then go into MIDI map, you're setting MIDI notes into Ableton, and MIDI notes can be mapped just like MIDI CCs can. So what this means is that if I select a parameter like this, it's going to map this parameter to the next MIDI note that gets received. So that's just any one of these that happens to be being sent at that time. So if you notice that your MIDI mappings are containing notes like this, it probably means that you've got a sequence running while you're trying to do MIDI mapping. So maybe turn your MIDI mapping off, make sure you clear that sequence, and then turn MIDI mapping on once there's no MIDI notes coming in, and then you can sequence things. If you make a wrong note, obviously you can just delete it just by selecting it and hit delete if you make a wrong mapping. All right, so that's it for this video.